what makes is several reasons why this segment on the Readout with Joy and Reid on MSNBC is surprising. One, the topic being colonization, and it stems from what's happening in Palestine, but it's more of a general topic conversation, not specific to Palestine. And it talks about colonization, the devastation that colonization brings. That's surprising. But what's also surprising is who she decided to bring on to talk about these subjects. Now, if you had to make a list of the last people you would talk to about colonization, I think people from the State Department would be at the top of that list. Top 3. State Department person. Yet she brings on 2 State Department officials, and one of them is not only a State Department official, but he's ex-CIA director. This is a very unusual segment to bring on 2 State Departments, but it's still a base segment. Let's watch.
This conflict between Israel and Gaza has divided not just the region, but the entire world. And we're seeing a stark contrast in just how different world leaders are responding to the conflict. President Biden, in an op-ed this weekend in the Washington Post, doubled down on his full support for Israel and his opposition to a ceasefire, even as Israel's ground assault in the Gaza Strip continued, with forces entering a second hospital and with the death toll in Gaza now topping 13,000. Biden's stance places him at odds with parts of his own coalition at home, and with the French president and Irish leaders, and with many non-European nations who are echoing the ceasefire calls that we're seeing on American campuses in protests and from groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. The president of South Africa last week filed a referral to the International Criminal Court for an investigation into what he calls war crimes being committed by Israel in Gaza. This conflict highlights what has been a growing rift between what's called the Global South and the West, whose post-World War II order, led by the U.S., has largely produced wealth and political stability for Europe, with obvious huge exceptions like Ukraine, but that for over a century has delivered colonialism, slavery, and exploitation.
I mean, listen to that. Like, I was watching this, I was like, what did she say? I was very surprised. I'm going to rewind it so you can hear. If you didn't catch, this is amazing to me. Let's listen.
In Gaza, now topping 13,000. Biden's stance places him at odds with parts of his own coalition at home, and with the French president and Irish leaders, and with many non-European nations who are echoing the ceasefire calls that we're seeing on American campuses in protests and from groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. The president of South Africa last week filed a referral to the International Criminal Court for an investigation into what he calls war crimes being committed by Israel in Gaza. This conflict highlights what has been a growing rift between what's called the Global South and the West, whose post-World War II order, led by the U.S., has largely produced wealth.
Post-World War II order has largely produced wealth. And saying that we are at odds with the Global South. This is some amazing, at least virtue signaling analysis. Let's continue.
And political stability for Europe, with obvious huge exceptions like Ukraine, but that for over a century has delivered colonialism, slavery, and exploitation for resource-rich but economically poor developing.
Listen to what she's saying. Resource-rich but economically underdeveloped poor countries. How is that possible? Who has the resources, Joanne? Where did the resources go? This is amazing to me.
Colonialism, slavery, and exploitation for resource-rich but economically poor developing countries in what we used to call the third world, particularly in Africa, whose countries have faced constant wars, coups, and political unrest. But in just a matter of years, they are expected to be a major global powerhouse. As the New York Times writes, the population there is projected to nearly double to.
So if you're hearing this for the first time, I began to read about this maybe early last year. And this is from the New York Times. They just wrote this a couple of about a month ago yesterday. The headline is "The World is Becoming More African." And let me read what it says here. Astonishing change is underway in Africa, where the population is projected to nearly double to 2.5 billion over the next quarter century, 25 years. An era that will not only transform many African countries, experts say, but also radically reshape their relationship with the rest of the world. What she's saying is they're not going to be the subordinate class, the subordinate continent, the people just laying down, handing over their resources while they starve. That era is over or coming to an end, and that's what they mean by also radically reshape their relationship with the rest of the world. The relationship now is exploitation. But let's continue with the segment.
To 2.5 billion over the next quarter century, an era that will not only transform many African countries, experts say, but also radically reshape their relationship with the rest of the world. Joining me now is Nayyirah Haq, former senior advisor for the State Department, former White House senior director and MSNBC columnist, and John Brennan, former CIA director and MSNBC senior national security analyst. Thank you both for being here. Nayyirah, it is a shifting world. And the Israel conflict, I think, it didn't start it. It just highlights it, because there definitely is a difference between the way the global South feels about the conflict and the way the U.S. and most of Europe, excepting the leaders of France and Ireland, feel about it. Talk a little bit about why that matters and how that will impact other issues.
So, talk about why that matters and why that impact. Ask yourself, why would Joy-Ann Reid have a discussion and ask this question to people who on paper would seemingly not have any background knowledge in this area? Why is there two ex-State Department people in this segment? And more importantly, why is there an ex-CIA director talking about colonialism? You mean to tell me Joy-Ann Reid never heard of Margaret Kimberly, Ajamu Baraka, Vijay Prasad? I mean, I could go on. Like, you haven't heard of scholars? I mean, even Cornel West. This is very. Thought this was very strange, but the information's based. It's almost like these are the guards to make sure the person in the middle stays within a particular talking point line, even if it's a base segment. That's what it feels like to me. Let's continue.
Issues that the U.S. has around the world.
So much of what we hear right now about the United States as a global power is falling on the ears of a generation that has grown up in the wake of 9/11, U.S. involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that had devastating consequences for the Middle East and throughout the United States as well, whether it be civil rights or just a broader understanding of what it means to
her call drops, and then they go to
It's
him.
frozen. Okay, we're gonna let the interwebs get themselves together. We love a little technical difficulty, so we're gonna let that work out. I'm gonna go to you, John Brennan. You know, when you know, my father was a young man growing up in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there was this sort of contest between Moscow and Washington over who was going to get the young men of the continent in these newly liberated countries that had been beset by colonialism. And, you know, what Belgium did to the Congo, 20 million people dead, lots of bad feelings with the West. But the West basically won the contest largely for young African men to come. Barack Obama's father, lots of people came to the United States, were educated here, and the West kind of was winning that war. Now it seems it's kind of going the other way. China recently welcomed Arab and Muslim foreign ministers on talks on ending the war in Gaza. This is the quote from the Associated Press today. China's top diplomat welcomed the ministers from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, the Palestinian Authority, and Indonesia to Beijing, saying his country would work with our brothers and sisters in the Arab and Islamic world to try to end the war in Gaza as soon as possible. You've had Chinese and Russian officials visiting African nations, cultivating relationships. You've had a real resistance to jumping on board the pro-Ukraine stance in lots of African nations. And now the same thing is happening with more African nations siding with Gaza. Is the U.S. becoming isolated from this global South, which is going to represent a huge portion of the economy in the coming years?
That is an astonishing question. In particular, to be asking a CIA director, is the United States becoming isolated? And I think that question sort of speaks to why there is State Department people in this segment. Let's continue and see what the answer is.
Well, I think, as you point out, Joy, there is growing sentiment in the third world, in the developing world, that there is this concern that the United States and the West has been exploiting these countries for many, many years. And now, unfortunately, given that we have seen for the past 6+ weeks in Gaza, the continued civilian deaths that have taken place as a result of Israeli strikes, I think it's generating a lot of sympathy, empathy for the Palestinian people who have been on their own quest for nationhood and statehood. So I think a lot of people, especially in Africa, that have had to struggle for decades in the past number of years for their own statehood, they can relate to that.
Struggle against who? Ex-CIA director? Struggle against who? Who are they struggling against? These African nations that you're talking about. It's like he's talking about somebody else. Because he can't say the government, he's part of it. He should be saying we. I'll rewind it slightly to get the entirety of what he's saying here in this last part and let it continue.
Who have been on their own quest for nationhood and statehood. So I think a lot of people, especially in Africa, that have had to struggle for decades in the past number of years for their own statehood, they can relate to that. But I do think that they see this, the bloodshed, the pain, the suffering of individuals, and they see it at the hands, quite frankly, of an advanced country such as Israel that is supported and backed by the West. Israel is advanced economically, technologically, a big, powerful military against the Palestinian people. So I think it's being seen through that prism that this is something that, again, the West is responsible for. And there's not the same understanding of the years of conflict that really have, I think, beset this part of the world.
You know, when he says it's not the same understanding, he's saying they don't buy the bullshit narrative that the United States have been pushing. That's what that means. It's not the same understanding. They do not buy our lies like our citizens do. This is a great
and
segment.
also in the case of Africa specifically, this is a very young population. It's the youngest population of all of the world, and 1 in 4 very soon humans on the earth are going to be African, and these are young people. Is part of the issue here.
1 in 4 humans on the planet will be African. That's what they mean by the future is African. This is the change. We are, because there has to be a ramp up to this sort of African liberation that is on the horizon. Economic liberation, resource stealing liberation. But yeah, I don't want to go on a tangent. Let's stay here so we can get through this.
Here that there is this sort of new understanding. There's a growing sort of Pan-Africanism on the continent, and a growing understanding of the past in a new way of saying, you know what, this colonial history, we want to now address it. And there's a lot of anger at Europe and the West, right? A lot of anger at France, a lot of anger at the United States.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of it is understandable given their history, but also I think this is a reflection of the.
Is he a black studies teacher at Morehouse College, or is he the ex-CIA director here? I didn't know. I think, is this Brennan? I didn't know this guy. Yeah, John Brennan. I didn't know he was a well-versed radical on oppression and colonialism. It's amazing. So it speaks to them. They know, yet they still do wrong.
You know what, this colonial history, we want to now address it. And there's a lot of anger at Europe and the West, right? A lot of anger at France, a lot of anger at the United States.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of it is understandable given their history, but also I think this is a reflection of the world that we live in right now in terms of just the availability of the communication system, social media, the fact that they can turn
the internets
on TV and look at what's happening in a real-time way. And so therefore, particularly the younger generations who are very technically savvy, they have their cell phones no matter where they are throughout Africa or the rest of the developing world. They see what is happening there. And there is this resentment about the West. It's basically the struggle between the haves and the have-nots. And I think there's just natural sympathy for those individuals who may, in fact, be similarly oppressed, or what they view to be oppressed by the West. And
I feel like this is a Mission Impossible psyop, and John Brennan is going to go and pull one of those Mission Impossible and just rip his mask off, and it's like Tom Cruise underneath. Who is this guy? Who is this guy that sounds like a ethnic studies professor? Amazing. I gotta hear what he says. This last point he makes again. Let me play it now. Let it play through.
Real-time way. And so therefore, particularly the younger generations who are very technically savvy, they have their cell phones no matter where they are throughout Africa or the rest of the developing world. They see what is happening there. And there is this resentment about the West. It's basically the struggle between the haves and the have-nots. And I think there's just natural sympathy for those individuals who may, in fact, be similarly oppressed, or what they view to be oppressed by the West. And given that the United States is such a staunch supporter of Israel, they tend to identify the United States with what is happening in Gaza. And I think that is...
they're a strong supporter. So... if there was a slave owner and there was another person who wasn't a slave owner, and that other person wasn't a slave owner, had a lot of money, I don't own slaves, I'm good, I'm the good ones, I don't own any slaves, but they're handing hundreds of thousands of dollars to their neighbor that's a slave owner, we're not supposed to get mad at him? That's what's supposed to happen, John Brennan? You're supporting apartheid, you're supporting genocide financially with the weapons and the bombs that they're using to kill people, children, women, men. It's from our money. Our taxpayer money has blood on it. I am just so amazed that this is an ex-CIA director saying this.
Similarly oppressed, or what they view to be oppressed by the West. And given that the United States is such a staunch supporter of Israel, they tend to identify the United States with what is happening in Gaza. And I think that is unfortunate in terms of attributing some of this violence or bloodshed to the United States.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't know that for a very, very long time, the South African, the African National Congress, et cetera, have always been sort of have been very identified with the Palestinian movement, freedom movement. I have Naira back. Look, the Gremlins have released her. And Naira, let's talk about, I think one of the big issues that I've seen people talk about is the coltan issue in Democratic Republic of Congo, what people call a slow motion genocide, the fact that the resources under the feet of people in Africa are riches. They sort of describe the Africa sort of all.
Yeah, these two were absolutely here to be as the guardrails for this conversation. It's so bizarre to have these people on. I got to say it again because she's about to answer this question. It's so bizarre that this dynamic happened with these two.
It's all Wakanda. They've all got gold and coltan and oil and everything else, but they don't profit from it. The West relies on it, sucks those resources out, and becomes super rich. They get really nothing for it. And so how does that end up getting rebalanced? Can the West rebalance this relationship and allow these countries to profit more from their own resources in a way that makes things more equal?
How about you just give them their shit? You hear in the question, she's saying, yes, we've been exploiting them. How do we make our exploitation a little bit better, a little more equal?
And should they do it? Because it seems that they're definitely losing the hearts and minds.
Well, we're talking about the entire colonial structure, right? And what's been left afterwards, in which colonialists, mostly the West, some of what we now see as Spain and Hispanic, but also part of this colonial project, that they went into countries, they took over, they also raised up a group of indigenous people to be the effective overseers. That's who's left in charge of many of these countries, whether it be Afghanistan or the Congo. And so you now have this power class that is deeply corrupt, is also deeply invested in benefiting personally from the extraction. And we don't have an international regime that is good at addressing that.
So her answer to the United States and the West extracting resources is that there's sellouts that are selling it to us. Those people are the problem. So when you thought she was going to give a based answer, she said, no, thank you.
So, we talk about democracy and how expanding democracy will bring human rights to many countries. That's not the reality on the ground for many places, where democracy is also synonymous with massive corruption. If you look at global surveys, you see not only that the majority of the African continent is under the age of 25 years old, you also find that they are some of the people with the least resources and least access.
Yeah.
What? That she didn't address anything of the question at all. On purpose, of course, but let's
this
let
is
her
a very important
conversation.
I want to keep having it, and so I'm glad we got a chance to get it started tonight. Naira Haque, thank you. I'm glad you were released from the spell of the demons of technology. Thank you. I'm glad you were here. And Director John Brennan, thank you both.
I can't believe John Brennan. John Brennan is now preaching radical colonialism and the effects of it. Amazing. I'm waiting to find out what's behind this. I don't know what it is right now, but I'm waiting to find out what's behind this.